Back in 2017, I stopped lifting weights. Now, the reason that I stopped lifting was that I was in chronic pain. And I believed that lifting was making underlying postural imbalances worse. It was around this time that I found postural exercises, and I thought, this is the answer. And while these exercises clearly helped, the changes never seemed to stick. And this led me to keep searching online for the perfect exercise or the correct form, and I stayed in this cycle while my health, both mentally and physically, took a nosedive. Now, this is what I call rehab purgatory, and lucky for me, the pandemic hit, and out of fear for my own life, I just started training again. But this time, I came up with a better solution. One that would allow me to make progress not only on the postural imbalance side, but also with strength at the same time. The answer was to combine the two. Instead of avoiding lifting, I integrated posture into my lifting. So if you want to improve posture while getting stronger and lifting weights, then you've come to the right video. We're gonna break down how to squat, bench, and deadlift and improve your posture at the same time. So let's go ahead and jump right in. All right, so posture is basically just how you hold yourself. And it's influenced by structure as well as the activities you do. And in the short term, there's these moment-to-moment changes that happen. So whether it's your emotions, the mood you're in, the activities you're doing, or the environment, there are these short-term changes. Now, over time, there are also long-term changes. These are patterns that can become really perpetual, and they can become perpetual to the point where we actually lose access to opposing positions. This is when people begin to feel stuck in a certain posture. Now, the aim of any good posture program is going to be to oppose these positions that we're in. And by doing this, we can round out the way we move and give the body the choice to select a different posture. Now, there's a problem with posture programs though, and it's that most posture programs cause only short-term changes, but not long-term adaptations. Now, there's two reasons for this. First of all, programs aren't progressive, meaning they don't get harder over time. And number two, they're not integrating these postural cues into normal movements. And because of this, we default back to our usual posture. Especially when things get challenging, we just go back to what we know and what's reliable for the body. Now, luckily there's a solution, and that solution is twofold. First of all, we need to make the program progressive, and second of all, integrated. If we can have more options for movement while also being able to meet challenges, then the changes are more likely to stick. Now, a typical program like this is going to take about 8 weeks to see meaningful changes, but in as little as a few sessions, you can notice subjective changes in the way your body is moving and feeling. Now, the way we're gonna do this is by first identifying the postural bias and then opposing this bias in training. So here's a simple framework. Number one, identify your posture. Number two, choose the exercises, positions, and cues that help oppose it. And number three, decide how much of this you wanna do in your program. So in this video, I'm gonna talk about two kinds of postures, and then we're gonna go through how to adapt these for squat, bench, and deadlift. We're going to touch on 3 criteria for each posture and exercise, which is going to be exercise variation, body position, and important cues. And then at the end, we're going to talk about how to use these in the context of a training program. All right, so here we're gonna highlight 2 common postures, and these represent the extremes of the postural spectrum. So as humans are moving, we move mainly in the front to back or sagittal plane. So these are movements that either arch the back and cause us to extend, or round the back and cause us to flex. Most people are gonna bias either flexion or extension. And the 2 most common postures are gonna be anterior pelvic tilt and rib flare, and then swayback posture. Anterior pelvic tilt is when the pelvis tips forward, and then rib flare is when the rib cage tips back from the bottom position and the bottom sticks forward. This is an extension biased posture. Swayback, on the other hand, is gonna be when that pelvis tucks under and gets pushed forward at the bottom, and then to compensate, this mid and upper back moves back, which then compresses the front of the chest. This overall is a flexion biased posture. So now let's go through the squat, bench, and deadlift and talk about how we can adapt these lifts for each of these postures. All right, so for all of these exercises, we're gonna be distinguishing between the anterior pelvic tilt rib flare individual and the more swayback individual. So this person with anterior pelvic tilt and rib flare, they're gonna be in this position where the upper half of the pelvis comes more forward than the rest of the pelvis. They're going to be relatively arched here in through their spine. And the goal from a pelvis perspective with all of these exercises is going to be to bring the upper half of the pelvis back and allow a little bit of relative rounding here in the low back. With the swayback individual, it's going to be just the opposite. They are tilted forward here in the lower pelvis and have very tight lower glutes. Up here at the top of the pelvis, they're going to be relatively shifted back and relatively rounded. So these individuals, we really want to think about getting that lower half of the pelvis to come back in space to open up this lower glute area. And then relatively speaking, the top of the pelvis and lumbar spine are going to move forward towards nutation in the sacrum and extension in the lumbar spine. Up in the rib cage, these individuals that have rib flare, usually with anterior pelvic tilt, are going to be more in this extended position. So for these individuals, we're going to want them to get this lower part of the rib cage to come back a little bit, and then the ribs to go from this flared out kind of position like this to more of a tucked in position like this. Now the swayback individuals oftentimes are too far back here through the rib cage and then depressed through the sternum. So oftentimes what we want to do here is to lift the top of the rib cage and allow that sternum to come up while allowing the spine overall to be a little bit less rounded. All right, so starting off with the squat, from an exercise selection standpoint, if we were that person who was real arched up in space, anterior pelvic tilt, we want to do two things. We want to get a variation that allows us to shift back in space and allows us to move relatively straight up and down. Now there's going to be two factors that are going to contribute to this and make it easier to achieve this, and those are going to be whether or not we want to elevate the heels and where we place the load. Now, in this specific example of trying to get further back in space, we're going to want to place the load on the front of the body to act as a counterbalance. So here I'm using a ramp by squatwedges.com. I'll link it down below if you want one. And as you're going to see, this is going to allow me to squat relatively straight up and down. So just by being here, I get more weight in the heels, which is a cue that we're going to want to use, and we can basically squat just straight down, straight up. Now in terms of loading this exercise, if I really wanted to make it easy to shift back, I could do something like a goblet squat. The goblet squat makes it super easy because I can hold that weight straight out in front of the body, which then acts as a counterbalance, allowing me to really relax back and let that spine round as I get towards the bottom of the motion. Now the only downside to the goblet squat is that it's often hard to hold the weight if we're already pretty strong. So a good alternative is something that's barbell loaded like a Zercher squat. A Zercher squat is gonna feature a barbell in the crook of the elbows, and we can reach it a little bit forward, but not as far forward as the goblet, but we're still gonna be able to go pretty much straight up and down. And then closer to the arched end of the spectrum, but still a straight up and down movement, is the barbell front squat. So we're still gonna have the weight on the front of the body, but because we have the barbell up on the chest, it is harder to resist the tendency to wanna arch and flare. So if we can get that lower rib cage to come back, take a nice breath and expand that area, while simultaneously breathing up into the bar, we can then go pretty much straight up and down, especially if we're elevating the heels, and this continues to be a good option. Now in terms of cues for that anterior pelvic tilt rib flare individual, I like to think about getting heavy in the heels. Regardless of if we're using heel elevation or not, we're gonna allow that rib cage to shift back into space. I'm gonna take a breath and I'm gonna try to feel this area of the lower rib cage expand, and I'm gonna feel the top of that pelvis come back. Once I'm in that kind of position, I should be able to more easily go straight up and down. Inhale on the way down, reaching the knees forward, letting the hips drop towards the heels, then exhale to stand up. Now, if I'm that swayback individual, a lot of this is going to reverse. So instead of wanting to have the weight in front, I'm gonna wanna have the weight in back. Instead of elevating the heels, I'm probably gonna do this with a flat foot. Now, one of the major differences here is that if you are that swayback individual, you're probably gonna benefit more from using a mid-foot cue instead of a heel-heavy cue. So for these individuals, starting with something like a front squat can work really well because it's starting in a little bit more of a squatty rounded position, but then they can progress to something like a back squat. So if I do my back squat here, I can take a breath in up into the bar, Exhale, pull my guts up and in. Keep midfoot pressure, inhaling on the way down, exhaling on the way up. And as I'm going down, I'm just trying not to let my pelvis rock back any more than it is currently. And I'm thinking about really letting that lower half of the pelvis open up as I'm in this slightly hinged position as I come to the bottom. Now, what I might also do here is to limit my range of motion so that I'm a little bit closer to the midway point of the squat versus the bottom of the squat where the rounding would usually occur. Again, inhaling into the bar, feeling that upper back and chest expand. Exhale to pull the guts in. Then inhale as I come down, trying to keep more pressure through the midfoot and restricting that range of motion to be a little bit more in the middle. All right, so now moving here to the bench, we have a bias towards an arch in a bench press that's pretty strong. So if we're that rib flared, anteriorly pelvic tilted person, then we're probably gonna wanna do something a little bit different. So the usual position for our bench press, again, is very arched. And part of this is that we have the feet that have to be on the floor, and we're trying to create as much tension as we can and as much stability as we can so that we really have a stable foundation to push from. Now, when we're in this position, the scapula pulls back around that upper back, reinforcing that position of flared ribs. And then we have a lot of space here underneath the back, which reinforces the position of the anterior pelvic tilt. Again, this is fine to train, but if we're trying to get the opposing positions, then we need to reconstruct this exercise a little bit. So going through each of what I just said, what we might want to do is get the feet up so we can get the pelvis back and get the rib cage down and the shoulder blades wrapping around. Now, this is an extreme variation of that. This will allow me to push my heels down, tuck my pelvis a little bit, get the upper part of the pelvis to come onto the bench, get my entire back flat onto the bench, and be able to get my ribs here to kind of pull down and in. And then from here, as I move the bar, it's gonna be really easy for me to reach my shoulder blades up. So as we can see here, it's really easy for me to reach up with the shoulder blades. As I come down, I let them come down naturally, but as I go up, I don't try to keep them back. Now, one of the issues with this variation is it's gonna be very unstable and hard for us to control the weight. We're not gonna get much stimulus to the working muscles here if we have this reduced stability. So the way that we can get around this is if we can elevate the heels. So you can see that with the feet on the ground like this, I go into a strong arch. But even if I begin to elevate the heels just a little bit right here onto the rests, I can actually tuck my pelvis down a little bit more because I'm not in so much passive hip extension. Now, if I want to put a dumbbell under each foot and get that even a little higher, then I can really rock back here and still have some leg drive and stability from below, while also having the opposing position up in the pelvis, rib cage, and shoulder. Now, when it comes to that swayback individual, just the position of a normal bench press is already gonna put us towards more of an arch. So just getting into a position of a bench press and learning how to execute the movement as would normally be instructed is probably gonna be a good play. Now, there are some nuances like we mentioned here at the rib cage. There is a difference between pushing that whole rib cage up and away from the bench versus lifting that chest up while not arching that whole rib cage up and away. I think both can be beneficial for that swayback individual. If you're someone who has some discomfort with that arching, I'd recommend keeping the lower part of the rib cage on the actual bench, then inhaling to expand the sternum, feeling some measure of expansion front to back, and then from this position, you can go into the movement. What you'll notice here is that as you're in this position, naturally the shoulder blades pull back, which is a good position for those individuals who tend towards that swayback posture. Here on the way down, I would keep that sternum tall, inhaling on the way down, really getting a good stretch in the chest. And then as we exhale, we're gonna bring the arms together, but we're not going to allow the shoulder blades to move up away from the bench. And for that individual with swayback, it can also be useful to play with other angles of reaching. So something like an incline press might actually work better because it's going to allow them to expand that upper chest that tends to be a little bit more compressed. All right, so last but certainly not least, we have the deadlift. And just like in the squat, we have variations that will bias more extension and relatively more flexion. So when we look at the most extended kind of variations, it's usually going to be stiff-legged deadlifts or Romanian deadlifts. These activities are going to usually start from the top with the weight already in the hand, and then we're going to shift back in space with a pretty strong arch in the back. So here, if we're starting at the top, we arch the back, and then we're going to come down mainly by shifting the hips straight back in space while maintaining that arch. So if you're that anterior pelvic tilt, rib flared individual, you might choose something like the conventional deadlift, which is just going to bias you towards a little bit more rounding to begin with. And then what you might actually do is think about adopting a little bit more of a rounded kind of position in your setup, allowing the upper pelvis to come back a little bit and that lower rib cage to come back as well. You should note that in your deadlift, you want whatever amount of rounding in your back you start with to be maintained or reduced as you go through the movement. So I don't want to start here and then have more back rounding as I go to pull. I want to keep whatever amount of rounding I have, get all the slack out of the bar, push down, and get to the top. Here at the top, I'm going to likely extend a little bit at that lumbar spine as I finish and bring the hips to the bar. Now, if I am that more anteriorly pelvic tilted, rib flared individual, a great cue to help control that pelvis and low back is going to be to bring the sit bones toward the heels as I extend the pelvis. That's going to keep that upper part of the pelvis and lumbar spine a little bit more back in space throughout the movement. Now, on the flip side, if I'm that individual who's in more of a swayback, I actually want to open up the back bottom part of that pelvis. So to do this, we can use a completely different cue, which is going to be to bring the pubic bone, so the bone here in the front, we want to bring it between the upper legs, and then think about almost opening, I know it's kind of weird, but opening the butt up and really trying to get as much space back there as possible at the bottom. That's going to allow us to arch the back and keep this upper half of the pelvis a little bit more forward relative to the lower half of the pelvis. Now, for your swayback individual, they're going to have more of a chest up kind of mentality, but you want to distinguish between chest up, which is just maintaining enough of a head up position to have a sternum that faces in the right direction throughout the activity, and then actually orienting the whole rib cage as a unit. So real quick, I'll show you what not to do first and then what to do second. So let's say I'm that swayback individual. I am going to think pubic bone down and back between the legs, but I don't want to do this with the rib cage. Notice how my rib cage gets out in front of my entire body, which then causes my low back to round. Instead, what I want to do is think about pubic bone down and back between the upper legs, keeping the sternum relatively tall, but not pushing that whole rib cage forward as a unit, but instead allowing it to come back as a natural consequence of the pelvis motion. Inhaling back, pubic bone down between the upper legs, and I'm keeping my back away from the ground, letting it only come to the ground as a consequence of my pelvis motion. So now that we've ironed out these details, let's talk about how to integrate these into a program. So when it comes to programming, a lot of people have this all or nothing attitude, and it's the biggest mistake I see. Now, it's normal to have things that play to your strengths and also things that you're going to have to address that are your weaknesses. You're not going to make things worse by reinforcing positions that you already use. You will only make things better by also adding positions that you don't use. It's maintaining what you can do and then catching up what you can't that makes you a better overall mover. So one of the best things you can do from a programming standpoint is to include both variations. How much of each? Well, that depends on your goal. So let's say you've got anterior pelvic tilt and rib flare. Strength is your first priority and posture is your second. You might have a lot of squat, bench, and deadlift variations that put you into more of an arched position. These lifts might continue to be your primary variations. They're going to likely go first on their respective days. But on the other days, you could include some variations that put you into a bit more of a rounded position. On your squat day, you might program some lighter, higher rep feet elevated benching. And on your deadlift day, you might do heels elevated goblet squat as an accessory. On your bench day, you might throw in some Jefferson curls, considering lighter loads and building up so that your volume approaches that of your primary variation. Now you could also invert this. So let's say goal 1 is to improve posture and then goal 2 is to simply maintain strength. You could program more rounded variations as part of your primary lifts. Then for your secondaries, you might continue to train your usual position, albeit at a lower volume. High weight, low reps to maintain strength, and then do moderate work on your new primary exercise. You could run this for 4 to 8 weeks and then switch back while maintaining that strength in that 4 to 8 week period. Now for the swayback people, the nice thing is that strength lifts have this arched back. So for these individuals, it's usually as easy as progressing in the gym. But often the hard thing here is finding a good entry point. A lot of swayback individuals tend to be your looser, weaker, and often less active folks. This means that you might have to start off a little rounded in their usual position and then work gradually towards being a bit more arched. You might also have to work on distinguishing arching from orientation of the whole rib cage. They often struggle to deadlift or squat without pushing their whole rib cage forward. Now, sometimes the best thing to do is to work on a strength machine circuit first, just to develop some baseline strength, and then as that strength develops, they can rely less on substituting with these big, obvious movements of the whole rib cage. Now, if you want to learn more about this and how to design a posture-based training program, go ahead and join me inside of Total Body Restoration. The link is down in the bio, and inside we cover major restorative exercises and lifts through the lens of posture and breathing. By the end, you'll know the mobility exercises, posture cues, and lifting exercises that will work best for you. All right, so that does it for this video. Until next time, thanks for watching, and peace.